Have you ever noticed something strange about anxiety at night? During the day, your mind may feel manageable. You go through conversations, tasks, small problems, and responsibilities. But when night arrives, something begins to change. The same thoughts that felt small during the day can suddenly feel heavier. Questions become louder. Small worries begin returning again and again, and sometimes it feels as if the mind refuses to settle. Your body may already be tired. The room is quiet. The lights are dim, yet the mind continues moving. For many people, nighttime anxiety feels stronger than it does during the day, and this experience is surprisingly common. In fact, psychologists often describe night time as the moment when the mind begins processing emotions that remained unnoticed during the day. Throughout the day, attention is constantly directed outward. There are conversations to follow, screens to look at, messages to answer, decisions to make. All of these activities keep the mind occupied. But when the day finally ends, the environment changes. External noise becomes softer, the body becomes still, and the mind begins turning inward. This shift is very natural. When stimulation decreases, the brain often begins reviewing experiences that happened earlier. Memories return, questions appear, and emotional signals that were quiet during the day can suddenly become easier to notice. For someone who already feels anxious, this quiet space can make those thoughts feel more intense. The same mind that managed the day successfully now begins examining everything more closely. A small worry may appear, then another thought follows, and slowly the mind becomes active again. Understanding why this happens requires looking at how the brain responds to quiet environments, because the night does something unusual to the way attention works. And once we understand this process, the experience begins to make much more sense. When night arrives and the outside world begins to grow quiet, the brain slowly shifts into a different mode of awareness. During the daytime, attention is constantly directed toward the environment. There are conversations to follow, tasks to complete, messages to answer, and countless small signals competing for the mind's focus. Because of this constant activity, most thoughts never stay in awareness for very long. The mind simply moves from one moment to the next. But nighttime changes this pattern. As the lights dim and the environment becomes still, the brain receives far fewer signals from the outside world. Without those distractions pulling attention outward, awareness naturally begins turning inward. Thoughts that remained unnoticed during the day can now move closer to the surface of the mind. A small concern from the afternoon may return. A conversation that felt slightly unresolved might appear again. Even a quiet question that never found an answer can suddenly feel more noticeable. Psychologists often describe this shift as a movement from external attention to internal reflection. During the day, attention flows outward toward the world around us. At night, attention gradually turns toward memory, interpretation, and emotional processing. When this shift happens, the brain often begins reviewing experiences from earlier in the day, not because something is wrong, but because the mind finally has the space to examine them more carefully. For someone who already feels anxious, this inward focus can make thoughts feel stronger than they did earlier. A small worry may lead to another thought. That thought may lead to another question, And slowly the mind begins building a chain of reflections that becomes difficult to interrupt. The quiet environment of the night does not create these thoughts, but it creates the perfect conditions for them to become easier to notice. And once the mind begins paying attention to them, the cycle of nighttime anxiety can slowly begin. Another reason anxiety can feel stronger at night is connected to the way the brain's natural daily rhythm influences emotion and attention. Throughout the day, the body follows a cycle that psychologists and neuroscientists often call the circadian rhythm. This rhythm quietly regulates many important processes inside the body, including energy levels, hormone activity, alertness, and sleep. During daylight hours, the brain is usually in a more active and problem-solving state. Attention is directed outward toward the environment, and most decisions are focused on immediate tasks. But as evening approaches, the body slowly begins preparing for rest. Light levels decrease, activity slows down, and the brain gradually shifts away from outward action toward inward awareness. This transition is completely natural. However, it also means that emotional signals can become easier to notice. During the day, the brain filters many emotional thoughts in order to stay focused on practical responsibilities. But when night time arrives, those filters begin relaxing. Thoughts that once felt small may now appear more clearly. Questions that were postponed earlier may quietly return. Even mild concerns can feel more noticeable when the mind has fewer distractions competing for attention. Another factor involves the brain's internal safety system. Deep inside the brain is a structure that constantly scans for potential threats or problems. This system is extremely helpful during the day because it helps us respond quickly to challenges in our environment. At night, however, when the world becomes quiet, the same system sometimes turns its attention inward. Instead of scanning the environment, it begins scanning our thoughts. Small uncertainties can suddenly appear larger. A question that once seemed minor may now feel worth examining more closely. The brain is not trying to create anxiety intentionally. It is simply doing what it has always been designed to do, searching for information that might help keep us safe. But in the stillness of the night, that search can easily become focused on our own thoughts. And when the mind begins paying close attention to those thoughts, anxiety can slowly begin to grow. One of the most surprising things about nighttime anxiety is that the thoughts themselves are often not very different from the ones we experience during the day. The worries may be exactly the same. A responsibility that still needs attention. A conversation that felt slightly uncomfortable. A decision that hasn't been fully resolved. Yet at night, those same thoughts can feel much heavier. This happens partly because the brain processes uncertainty differently when the environment becomes quiet. During the day, most thoughts are quickly replaced by new experiences. A worry may appear for a moment, but attention soon shifts to another task, another conversation, or another distraction. Because of this constant movement, the mind rarely stays with one concern for very long. Nighttime removes that constant flow of distractions. The mind is no longer moving quickly from one thing to the next. Instead, attention becomes steady and focused. When a thought appears, it can remain in awareness for much longer. And when the mind stays with a worry for a long period of time, the brain begins examining it more deeply. The situation may be replayed. Possible outcomes may be imagined. Questions may appear about what might happen in the future. This process can slowly increase the emotional intensity of the thought. A concern that felt manageable earlier in the day can now seem more important simply because the mind is spending more time thinking about it. Psychologists often describe this as a process called rumination. Rumination happens when the brain repeatedly analyzes the same situation without reaching a clear resolution. The mind circles around the thought again and again, searching for answers. At night, when the mind is already in a reflective state, rumination can become easier to fall into. The brain continues examining the same worry from different angles, and with each repetition, the thought may begin to feel more serious than it actually is. Understanding this pattern can make the experience feel less mysterious, because the mind is not suddenly creating new problems in the night. It is simply giving extra attention to thoughts that were already present during the day. Another reason anxiety can feel stronger at night is connected to the way the brain tries to predict possible outcomes. Human beings are naturally wired to imagine the future. This ability helps us prepare for challenges and make better decisions. Throughout the day, the brain constantly creates small predictions about what might happen next. Most of these predictions are practical and helpful. We plan conversations. We think about tasks that still need to be completed. We prepare ourselves for situations that might require attention. But when the mind begins focusing on worries, this same ability can work in a different way. Instead of imagining helpful possibilities, the brain may begin exploring uncertain or negative outcomes. During the day, these thoughts often pass quickly. The mind moves on to other responsibilities. New information replaces the worry before it has time to grow. At night, however, the brain has far more time to continue exploring the same question. If a worry appears, the mind may begin imagining several possible scenarios. One thought leads to another. Then another possibility appears, and soon the mind may feel as if it is searching through countless outcomes. Many of these imagined situations are not likely to happen at all. But the brain does not always distinguish clearly between realistic possibilities and unlikely ones. Its main goal is simply to examine what might occur. Because of this, nighttime thinking can sometimes feel like the mind is preparing for every possible problem. The more the brain explores these possibilities, the more attention becomes focused on the worry itself. And when attention stays fixed on a concern, the emotional feeling connected to it can slowly grow stronger. This is one reason why a small worry from earlier in the day can feel unexpectedly intense during the night. The mind has simply spent more time imagining it. Yet it is important to remember that the brain is not trying to create fear. It is simply using its natural ability to explore possibilities. And when the mind begins to relax again, these imagined outcomes usually fade just as quietly as they appeared. Memory also plays an important role in why anxiety sometimes feels stronger at night. Throughout the day, the brain is constantly recording experiences. Most of these moments are small and pass quickly. A short conversation, a task that required attention, a situation that created a brief emotional reaction. Even when we do not think about these moments again during the day, the brain quietly stores them. Later, when the environment becomes quiet, some of these memories may return. The mind begins reviewing them as part of a natural process that helps the brain learn from experience. This process is normally helpful. By revisiting events from earlier in the day, the brain can understand what happened and prepare for future situations. But when a memory contains uncertainty or emotional tension, the brain may spend more time examining it. A conversation that felt slightly uncomfortable may be replayed. A decision that still feels unfinished may return to awareness. The mind tries to understand whether anything important was missed. During the day, this type of reflection is often interrupted by new activities. Attention moves forward before the brain has time to analyze the situation deeply. At night, the mind has far fewer interruptions. This allows the brain to review memories more carefully. Sometimes the memory becomes clearer. Details that were not noticed earlier may appear more vivid. A small emotional reaction that seemed minor during the day may now feel more significant. This does not necessarily mean that the event itself was very important. It simply means that the brain is giving it more attention. When attention stays with a memory for a long time, the emotional signal connected to it can become stronger. This is another reason nighttime anxiety can grow gradually. The brain is not creating new experiences. It is simply revisiting the ones that already happened. And when those memories are examined repeatedly, the mind can begin to feel more alert again, even though the body is already ready for sleep. Another reason anxiety can become more noticeable at night is related to the way the brain processes emotional signals. During the day, the mind is constantly prioritizing practical tasks. Attention is focused on actions that need to be completed. Decisions must be made. Problems must be solved. Because of this, the brain often reduces the intensity of emotional signals in order to stay productive. This does not mean emotions disappear. It simply means they are temporarily placed in the background. But as the evening progresses, the brain begins shifting its priorities. The body starts preparing for rest. Energy levels slowly decrease, and the mind becomes less focused on solving external problems. Instead, it becomes more open to internal experiences. This change can make emotional signals easier to notice. A feeling that seemed small during the day may now appear more clearly. A thought that once passed quickly may now remain in awareness longer. For someone experiencing anxiety, this shift can make worries feel more intense. The mind becomes more sensitive to emotional information. Small uncertainties may suddenly feel worth examining again. The brain begins asking quiet questions. Was that situation handled correctly? Did something important get overlooked? Could a different decision have been better? These questions are part of the brain's natural attempt to understand experiences. But when they appear repeatedly during the night, they can gradually keep the mind active. The body may already be ready to sleep, yet the brain continues examining thoughts. Understanding this process can help explain why nighttime anxiety feels so familiar to many people. It is not simply a matter of worrying more. It is a result of the brain entering a quieter state where emotional signals become easier to notice. And when the mind begins paying attention to those signals, thoughts can remain active longer than expected. There is another reason anxiety often becomes more noticeable at night, and it has to do with the way the mind handles quiet moments. During the day, silence is actually quite rare. Even when we are not speaking, there are usually sounds around us. Movement, conversations, background noise, and constant activity fill the environment. Because of this, the brain rarely experiences complete stillness. But nighttime often brings a level of quiet that the mind does not encounter very often during the day. When the environment becomes this calm, attention naturally becomes more sensitive. Small thoughts that might have gone unnoticed earlier can suddenly become much clearer. It is similar to the way a faint sound becomes easier to hear when everything around it grows silent. In the same way, thoughts become easier to notice when the environment becomes quiet. For someone experiencing anxiety, this can create an unusual experience. The mind begins noticing every small thought that appears. A question about tomorrow, a memory from earlier in the day, a small uncertainty that still feels unresolved. Normally, these thoughts would pass quickly, but in the quiet of the night, the mind may pause and examine them. Once attention rests on a thought, it becomes easier for the brain to continue thinking about it. The mind begins exploring possibilities. It may revisit the same situation from several different angles, and slowly the thought becomes the center of attention. Yet the quiet environment itself is not the problem. In many ways, the quiet of the night is actually meant to help the mind rest. The brain is simply adjusting to the sudden absence of distractions. Once the mind settles into that quiet space, thoughts often begin to slow down again, and the same silence that first revealed those thoughts can eventually help them fade away. As the night continues and the mind remains quiet, something interesting often begins to happen. The thoughts that first appeared with urgency may slowly start changing their character. At the beginning, a worry might feel sharp and demanding. The mind tries to understand it quickly. It searches for answers, possibilities, and explanations. But when the same thought remains in awareness for a long period of time, the brain gradually becomes less reactive to it. This is a natural process that happens with many types of thoughts. The mind cannot maintain the same level of emotional intensity forever. Eventually, the brain begins adjusting to the presence of the thought. The urgency slowly softens. The worry may still be present, but it no longer feels quite as strong as it did when it first appeared. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the mind becoming familiar with its own thoughts. When a thought first appears, it may feel surprising or important, but after being observed for some time, the brain begins recognizing that nothing immediate needs to be done. The thought simply exists, and slowly the mind begins to relax around it. This is one reason many people notice that their thoughts begin to calm down after lying awake for a while. At first, the mind may feel very active, but as time passes, the brain gradually becomes less interested in continuing the same analysis. Attention begins loosening its grip. The thought that once demanded constant attention slowly begins drifting toward the background. The mind does not force it away. It simply begins letting it exist without reacting as strongly. And as this happens, the mind slowly becomes quieter again. After some time, the mind often begins to realize that the thoughts it has been examining do not require immediate action. This realization rarely appears suddenly. Instead, it happens gradually. At first, the brain may continue analyzing the same worry again and again. It may revisit the same question from different angles. It may imagine several possible outcomes. But eventually, the mind begins noticing something important. The situation being examined is not actually happening in the present moment. It exists only as a thought. This small recognition can slowly change the way the brain reacts. The thought may still appear, but the sense of urgency begins to fade. The mind becomes less focused on solving the problem immediately. Instead, it simply observes the thought as it passes through awareness. Psychologists sometimes describe this moment as the beginning of mental distance. The brain is no longer completely absorbed in the thought. It begins watching the thought instead of reacting to it. When this shift happens, the emotional intensity connected to the worry often begins to soften. The same thought may still return several times, but each time it may feel slightly less powerful. The mind slowly learns that the thought does not require action right now, and as that understanding grows, attention begins loosening its grip. The worry that once demanded constant attention starts drifting toward the background of the mind. The brain is simply recognizing that the night is not the moment for solving every question. Some thoughts can wait until the morning, and when the mind allows them to rest, the quiet of the night slowly begins returning again. As the mind spends more time in the quiet of the night, another subtle change often begins to take place. The thoughts that first appeared with urgency gradually lose some of their intensity. At the beginning of the night, a worry may feel sharp and demanding. The mind tries to understand it quickly. It searches for answers, possibilities, and explanations that might bring clarity. But the brain cannot maintain that level of emotional tension indefinitely. After some time, the nervous system naturally begins calming itself. The same thought may still appear, yet the emotional reaction connected to it slowly becomes softer. This happens because the brain gradually recognizes that nothing immediate needs to be done. The situation being examined is not happening in the present moment. It exists only in memory or imagination. Once the brain begins noticing this, its response changes. Instead of reacting strongly each time the thought appears, the mind starts observing it with more distance. The thought becomes something that is noticed rather than something that must be solved right away. This small shift can change the entire experience of nighttime thinking. The mind no longer feels trapped inside the thought. It simply becomes aware that the thought exists. And when awareness becomes calmer, the emotional weight of the worry often begins to dissolve. The same concern that once felt overwhelming may now appear quieter. It may still return from time to time, but each time it appears, the mind reacts a little less strongly. Gradually, the thought becomes just another passing moment in awareness. And as the brain grows less interested in continuing the analysis, attention slowly begins drifting toward a calmer state. As the night continues and the mind slowly grows quieter, another important change often begins to appear in the way thoughts are experienced. Earlier in the night, a worry may have felt very immediate. The brain treated it as something that required attention and analysis. But as time passes, the mind gradually starts realizing that the thought itself does not demand any action right now. This realization can happen very gently. The thought may still appear in awareness, yet the brain begins responding to it differently. Instead of reacting with urgency, the mind begins observing the thought more calmly. It becomes something that is noticed rather than something that must be solved immediately. Psychologists often describe this shift as the mind creating a small distance from its own thoughts. Rather than being completely absorbed in the worry, the brain begins seeing it as part of the natural flow of thinking. This change does not always happen instantly. Sometimes the same thought may appear several times before the mind fully relaxes around it. But each time it returns, the reaction often becomes a little weaker. The brain slowly recognizes that nothing dangerous is happening in the present moment. The body remains still, the room remains quiet, and the night continues moving forward in its calm rhythm. As this understanding grows, attention gradually begins releasing its focus on the worry. The mind becomes less interested in continuing the analysis. And once that happens, thoughts often begin drifting more slowly through awareness. The mind is no longer searching so intensely for answers. It is simply observing what appears and allowing it to pass. As the mind continues settling into the quiet of the night, many people begin noticing another subtle change in the way their thoughts behave. Earlier, the mind may have been actively examining worries and searching for answers. But after spending time with the same thoughts, the brain often begins recognizing a simple truth. Most of these thoughts are not problems that can be solved in the middle of the night. They are questions about the past or possibilities about the future. And neither of those situations exist in the present moment. When the brain slowly begins understanding this, its response changes. Instead of pushing harder to solve the thought, the mind gradually loosens its grip on the analysis. The thought may still appear, but the mind no longer feels the same pressure to resolve it immediately. Psychologists often explain that the brain eventually becomes tired of repeating the same mental loop. When a thought has been examined again and again without producing a clear answer, the mind slowly begins losing interest in continuing the cycle. This is not something that needs to be forced. It happens naturally when the brain realizes that further analysis is not helping. At this stage of the night, the mind often begins moving toward a calmer state. Thoughts still appear, but they move more slowly. The space between them becomes wider. Attention drifts more gently from one thought to another, and the mind begins shifting away from problem solving toward simple awareness. This transition is one of the quiet signals that the brain is preparing for rest. The mind is no longer trying to control every thought that appears. Instead, it simply notices them and allows them to pass. And as the night continues, that gentle process often becomes easier and easier. As the night continues and the mind grows quieter, many people begin noticing that their thoughts start slowing down on their own. Earlier in the night, the mind may have been searching for answers. It tried to understand worries. It replayed memories. It examined questions about the future. But after spending time with those thoughts, the brain slowly begins to change its approach. The mind realizes that continuing the same analysis is not bringing any new understanding. The same thoughts have already been explored. The same questions have already been asked. And slowly the brain begins loosening its focus. The thought may still appear for a moment, but the mind no longer follows it as far as before. Instead of building long chains of analysis, the thought simply passes through awareness. It appears, it is noticed, and then it fades again. This is one of the natural ways the brain begins preparing for sleep. Attention stops gripping each thought tightly. The mind becomes less interested in continuing the conversation with every worry that appears. And when the brain begins releasing that effort, The quiet of the night becomes easier to experience again. Thoughts move more gently. The space between them becomes larger, and the mind slowly begins settling into a calmer rhythm. As the night continues and the mind becomes more familiar with the quiet around it, many people begin noticing that their thoughts lose some of the urgency they once had. Earlier in the night, the brain may have been actively examining different worries. It tried to understand situations. It imagined possible outcomes. It searched for answers that might bring clarity. But after spending time with those thoughts, the mind gradually begins to recognize that continuing the same analysis is not bringing anything new. The same ideas have already appeared. The same questions have already been explored. And slowly the brain begins reducing the effort it puts into solving them. Instead of pushing forward with more analysis, attention begins softening. Thoughts may still appear for a moment, but the mind does not follow them as far as before. A worry may enter awareness. It may stay for a short time, and then it quietly fades again. This gentle change happens because the brain begins shifting from problem solving toward rest. The mind no longer needs to search for answers in the middle of the night. The body is already preparing for sleep. Breathing becomes slower. The environment remains calm and still, and the quiet of the night gradually becomes easier to accept. As this shift continues, the mind often becomes less interested in continuing the same mental conversations. Thoughts appear less frequently. The spaces between them grow longer, and awareness slowly begins settling into a calmer and more peaceful rhythm. As the quiet of the night continues, the mind often begins entering a more restful state. Thoughts still appear from time to time, but they usually arrive more slowly than before. Earlier in the night, the brain may have been actively searching for answers. It tried to understand worries. It explored different possibilities. But after spending time with those thoughts, the mind gradually begins letting them pass more easily. The brain recognizes that nothing in the present moment requires immediate attention. The room remains calm. The body is resting, and the night continues moving forward without urgency. When the mind notices this calm environment, its activity naturally begins to soften. A thought may appear briefly, but instead of following it deeply, awareness simply notices it. And then attention gently moves on again. This quiet shift is one of the ways the brain prepares itself for sleep. The mind no longer feels the need to analyze every idea that appears. Thoughts become lighter. They drift through awareness rather than demanding focus. And as they drift away, the quiet of the night slowly becomes more noticeable again. Many people find that this is the moment when the mind finally begins relaxing. The effort of thinking gradually fades, and the brain begins allowing itself to rest. As the night continues and the mind becomes more comfortable with the quiet around it, many people begin noticing that their thoughts grow softer. Earlier in the night, the brain may have been searching for answers. It explored worries. It examined possibilities. It tried to understand different situations from the day. But now that effort slowly begins to fade. The mind realizes that the night is not a moment for solving every question. Instead, it becomes a moment for rest. Thoughts may still appear from time to time. A memory may pass briefly through awareness. A small idea may surface for a moment, but the mind no longer follows those thoughts with the same intensity. They appear gently, and they disappear just as gently. The body remains still. Breathing continues slowly and naturally. The quiet of the room becomes more noticeable than the thoughts themselves. This quiet environment sends a simple message to the brain. Nothing urgent is happening. Nothing requires immediate attention. The night is calm, and the mind is allowed to rest within that calm. As awareness settles into this peaceful rhythm, thoughts gradually become less frequent. The mind no longer tries to hold on to them. Instead, it simply allows them to pass like small movements across a quiet surface. And with each passing moment, the mind grows a little quieter. As the night continues and the mind settles into the quiet around it, awareness often becomes softer and less focused on individual thoughts. Earlier in the night, the mind may have been moving from one idea to another, but now those thoughts begin slowing down. They appear more gently, and they pass more easily. The mind no longer feels the need to examine each thought in detail. Instead, awareness simply notices what appears and allows it to fade again. The room remains calm and still. The body rests comfortably. Breathing continues at its own quiet rhythm. Nothing in this moment requires effort or attention. The night carries a natural stillness with it. And as the mind becomes familiar with that stillness, thoughts gradually lose their importance. They drift through awareness like small ripples on calm water, appearing for a moment, then disappearing again. And with each passing moment, the quiet of the night becomes deeper and more noticeable. As the quiet of the night deepens, the mind often begins to drift further away from the thoughts that were once holding its attention. Earlier in the night, those thoughts may have seemed important. The brain tried to understand them. It searched for answers and possibilities. But now the mind begins letting them go. Thoughts still appear from time to time, but they arrive more gently than before. They no longer demand the same level of attention. Instead, they pass quietly through awareness. The body continues resting. Breathing remains slow and natural. The room stays calm and still. Nothing around you requires effort. Nothing needs to be solved right now. The night moves forward at its own peaceful rhythm, and the mind slowly follows that rhythm. Thoughts become lighter. They appear briefly, and then fade again into the quiet. As this happens, the mind begins drifting toward a deeper sense of rest. The effort of thinking gradually softens, and awareness begins settling into the calm stillness of the night. As the night continues in its quiet rhythm, the mind often begins letting go of the last remaining thoughts that were moving through awareness. Earlier, those thoughts may have seemed important. The brain examined them carefully. It tried to understand them. But now the mind no longer needs to follow them. Thoughts appear more softly, and they fade more easily. The body remains still and comfortable. Breathing continues slowly and naturally. The quiet of the room becomes the most noticeable thing in this moment. Nothing in the night asks for attention. Nothing requires effort. The mind is free to rest within the calm that surrounds it. If a thought appears, it can simply pass. There is no need to follow it, no need to solve it. It can drift away just as gently as it arrived. And as each thought fades, the mind grows quieter. The night continues, calm, still, peaceful. And in that quiet stillness, the mind slowly settles into rest.